Okay, take two. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. So there are albums that become popular, right? And then there are albums that seem to escape popularity entirely and move into mythology. These songs are not merely popular hits or whatever, they're things that take on a larger meaning for people. So in 1973, The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd did exactly that. It almost immediately started moving into the territory of beyond popular music. It became a cultural landmark, one of those albums that people talk about almost like a shared experience rather than a mere collection of mortal songs. And today we're looking a little bit at how the record was made. I'm not going to go into every spare detail, but I'm going to give you a basic overview and why it sounded so different and why more than 50 years later people still hold this up as one of the greatest albums ever recorded. So it was released in March of 1973. The Dark Side of the Moon arrived at a moment when Pink Floyd were evolving rapidly. Earlier Floyd records got heavily into experimentation. You had long instrumental passages, psychedelic detours, abstract soundscapes, sometimes brilliant and sometimes deliberately strange in a way that, admittedly was alienating for some listeners out there. And this album still has some experimental and psychedelic vibes in a way, but it feels different. It's definitely a little bit more accessible, but in like the best kind of way. It takes all of those experimental instincts and channels them into something more focused, still emotional, and surprisingly accessible. Instead of telling a straightforward story, the album works as a continuous experience that seems to comment on life itself. The songs flow into each other through tape effects, spoken word fragments, heartbeats, clocks, cash registers, and other layered studio transitions. Like you've got voices that pop up here and there. And it all gives the vibe of sort of a psychedelic journey, but also just a passage through time and life experience, which really makes this one of those catch all albums that is almost guaranteed to have some broad appeal. There isn't as much reading between the lines type of stuff here. There aren't that many, lost meanings or abstract lyrics that are just too hard to grasp. I think they were going for something that a lot of people would be able to understand and relate to. And that's one of the reasons this is such an iconic album for so many people. You don't really start or stop songs on this record, you drift through it. Well, granted, that's not entirely true. I can listen to some of these songs individually and they're just fine. There's sort of a stereotype about this album that it's not as good if you don't listen to it as a continuous journey, you have to experience it like a movie. But that's not entirely true. It's just best experienced in that way. And the themes holding everything together are indeed universal. It deals with pressure, time, money, conflict, mortality, and of course, mental health, which the band is pretty famous for grappling with the Sid Barrett story. You have heavy subjects here, but presented in a way that feels strangely intimate, and the album was recorded at Abbey Road Studios with engineer and producer Alan Parsons playing a significant role in shaping its sound. And this is where the record becomes fascinating because in the early 1970s, studio technology was nowhere near what we have right now. There was no digital editing, no unlimited tracks, no laptops. Everything had to be built physically and creatively, and the band used multi-track recording, analog synthesizers, tape loops, and extensive studio experimentation. They worked with instruments like the EMS VCS3 and Synthi A synthesizers. I'm not even sure if I'm saying those right, but maybe I am. I don't know. But that's what they worked with for the synthesizer kind of stuff, and it helped to create textures that still sound futuristic today. This is one of those albums. It doesn't sound totally dated. I mean, sure, there might be some aspects that you could say might sound 1970s esque, but really, it is kind of a timeless album when you really think about it. And even some of the album's most famous sound effects were painstakingly assembled by hand. Take Money, for example. That iconic loop of cash registers and coins wasn't simply grabbed from a sound library somewhere. They had individual sounds that were recorded separately onto tape and carefully stitched together into a rhythmic pattern. And that takes some skill and some, unique types of energy to just put that into a musical form. And the ticking clocks that explode at the beginning of time, same thing there. They were recorded independently, then layered together into one massive sonic event. And it's meticulous work, and it helped define the album's immersive atmosphere. You have the songs, sure, but you also have these like sort of segue parts, but they're also part of the song too. You know what I mean? It's not like these sounds are just silly decorations. They kind of weave throughout the album, and they kind of stitch it all together. And it just wouldn't be the same kind of album if you didn't have those sounds going on. So I consider it actually part of the music in the same way that, a regular musical instrument would be, that is played a little bit more conventionally. And musically, the album is definitely, it's got some progressive rock aspects, but it's smoother and more melodic than a lot of prog albums from that era. You hear these lush synthesizers and tape effects. You hear David Gilmour's expressive guitar work. You have Roger Waters' jazzy, fluid bass lines. Although, some people say that Roger Waters didn't play some of the key bass lines. And, I don't know exactly what the truth is of that, but, that's one of the constant critiques of Roger Waters is that he didn't actually play that bass line. That was actually David Gilmour who played that or whatever. I'll leave that debate up to maybe a different episode. Well, I might never get around to that, but you know what I mean. It's not really for me to say right here, right now. And underneath it all, there's this polished but slightly uneasy atmosphere, which is another hallmark of a lot of great albums, right? Like most great albums, and at least in my opinion, they're going to have some uneasy aspects to them. They're not going to be like these perfectly happy sounding songs. You're at least going to have a little bit of tension thrown in there somewhere, which is really one of the great things you have in great movies too. Like if you want to tell a great story, it shouldn't just be well, it usually shouldn't just be all cheerful and all like flowers and lollipops and puppy dogs or whatever. You know, it's not to say everything has to be depressing, but you want to have a little bit of tension so it actually makes the story a little bit more interesting. I mean, what would a Disney movie be if it was just like happy stuff happening? There really wouldn't be much of a story. And the same thing is true with a lot of great albums too. And this album sounds beautiful, in my opinion, but also tense a little bit, like something quietly unraveling beneath the surface. So I don't know if everybody really thinks about this album like it's dark, but there's an element of that. And I guess that's why some people pair this movie with, or this album with the movie The Wizard of Oz. It's a weird thing that you've probably heard if you've heard about this album, that some people they've experimented with playing this album with the entire movie The Wizard of Oz, not just select scenes, but there's a part where you actually have to like stop it at a certain point to get the album to line up properly. It's a little bit convoluted and complicated, but at least theoretically, there's a story that is told when you pair this music with that movie. And I've actually tried doing that with Nine Inch Nails, the Downward Spiral. trying to listen to that with The Wizard of Oz, but it doesn't really work in the same way, just so you know. But maybe there are some other albums that would have that type of experience if you played them, not necessarily with The Wizard of Oz, but with some other movies, you know. But it sounds like I'm going on a bizarre tangent here, but this is really part of this album's lore. You hear about that quite a lot, actually, and it's a fun challenge, I suppose. But anyway, moving on, the emotional tension is probably why this record still resonates with people. And let's talk about a few key tracks. I'm surprised I didn't get around to this that much yet, but you've got Time. That opens with one of the most recognizable intros in rock history, those layers of ticking clocks and alarms that are suddenly crashing together. And then the song shifts into a meditation on aging, routine, and realizing life is slipping by faster than expected. And oh boy, is that ever true. I'm 44 right now. It definitely feels like I should not be any older than 22. It feels like I should just be half my age. And I guess on the bright side of that, it I don't feel as bad about not accomplishing more because the time goes by so fast anyway. It's hard to really think of all these people accomplishing great things when time slips by so quickly. How is everybody going to be capable of mastering something and, changing some aspect of the world in a noticeable way if everybody's lives are just, whizzing by like the trees on the way on a train journey or something. You look out the window and all those trees are just flying by. And those are sort of like days, like there's also the cartoon image of the days just tearing off of a calendar. That's kind of what life is like. And things you thought you were going to be when you grew up, well, you might not always get to be those things. And this album definitely comments on that type of phenomenon. It's a little bit sad, but it's also a way to maybe make peace with that fact of life for a lot of us. And even if you are a bit successful, there will still be things that you never got to try in life, and you might have some regrets about that. That's why I don't believe people when they say, "Oh, I've lived a life that I have no regrets." Like BS. I call BS on that, man. Like, in fact, if you have no regrets, I kind of don't believe you. Like, I kind of think maybe you've got some skeletons that you're trying to hide. I don't know. But I think everybody's done some things that they regret, or at least said some things that they regret. It doesn't have to be like a murder or some, a violent assault or anything like that. Just at least some little things that seem major to us, and we kind of wish we had gone down a different path. That's and then there's all these, what if I had done things this way or that way? Could my entire life have been different? One thing I think about sometimes, going off on a tangent here, but I wonder what would have happened if I had actually made it to Washington, D.C. and the National Spelling Bee when I was in eighth grade, because I was actually one competitor away from actually going to D.C., but I got out on the word reservoir, damn it. And it's such an easy word, but I messed it up. And I sometimes wonder, what would have happened if I had made that trip? And what if I had studied harder and, taken a little bit more seriously? What if my family had hired a coach to actually professionally tutor me into better understanding the words and all that kind of stuff and the meanings behind the words? Could I have actually, you know, I don't know if I would have won the spelling bee, but even if I had made it to DC, my entire life could have ended up being different. And it sounds silly, but it's true. And a song like this, it might tap into that little part of your brain, and you might be like, "Oh yes, what if things had gone differently?" And in the middle of that song, David Gilmour delivers one of the defining guitar solos of the decade. And it really is a great guitar solo. That's one thing, No matter how many Pink Floyd bashers there are out there, they're not my favorite band either. But I have to admit, David Gilmour was a great guitar player. He played with feeling, and that's really the difference. He didn't always have like the flashiest guitar solos. They were actually pretty easy most of the time. But nevertheless, even skilled guitarists, they just cannot convey the feel that David Gilmour brings into it. You know what I mean? I'm not saying he's like not capable of any flashy guitar moments. Don't misconstrue my point here. I'm just saying that he's got feel, and that's really probably the most important thing you can have as a guitarist. It's what separates a bad note from a good one in a lot of cases. If you don't have feel, then you're just kind of it sounds like you're faking it, to be honest. And then there's the song Money. That's built around an unusual 7/4 rhythm, and the track mixes cynicism, groove, and satire. Those cash register effects are legendary, and beneath the hook is a pretty biting critique of greed and materialism. And man, I do like the bass line to Money as well. It's great. It's nice and simple and easy to play, but sometimes that simplicity can throw you off because if your timing is a little bit off on that bass groove, it can potentially ruin the whole experience. So that's why this might be one of those songs that could be a little bit trickier to cover than you might think. Because if something is even a little bit off, you might just ruin it and not necessarily in a good way. And what about Us and Them? Well, that slows everything down into something reflective and kind of mournful in a way. It's jazz influenced, spacious, and deeply human. And the album closes with Brain Damage and Eclipse, which I normally think of as the same song, like two parts of one song. It's a final sequence that pulls together many of the album's themes, like madness, isolation, pressure, and the strange sense that all human experiences are connected. It's one of the great album endings in rock music, and it's one of the reasons that you'll remember this album because it has a great closing song. There's also one performance on this album that deserves special attention. On the Great Gig in the Sky, session vocalist Claire Torrey delivers an improvised, wordless vocal performance that became one of the album's defining moments. According to the story that I've heard, much of it was recorded in essentially a single take. That there are different versions of that story. I've heard that it actually took more than one take, but it's entered the public imagination that it was done in a single take. No lyrics here, just raw emotion, and sometimes that's really all you need in music. The instrumental aspect, even if you do have vocals. I think sometimes people forget that sometimes you don't really need words. Just have the voice act as an instrument. And years later, Tori successfully pursued a co writing credit for her contribution. In other words, she actually had to sue to get that, but I guess they settled it out of court amicably. And, she is now recognized as an essential performance to that finished song. And honestly, it's hard to imagine the album without it. Would it really be the same album? Would it be as big of a hit? I don't know. I think that's really one of the crowning achievements of this album is just that instrumental, and those vocals. And visually, the album is iconic as well. You got that classic Prism cover designed by Storm Thorgerson and Hypnosis, and it's one of the most recognizable album covers ever created. It's simple, clean, and instantly memorable. And the prism splitting white light into a spectrum reflected both the band's elaborate stage lighting and the album's sense of thematic unity. It's one of those rare covers that became inseparable from the music itself. And it's a little bit like, I mean, there are definitely some other albums that have iconic covers like well, I don't need to name names here. You know what I'm getting at. But I gotta say this: I have a parody T-shirt that of this album cover that pairs it with an image of Sigmund Freud, and it says "Pink Floyd, the Dark Side of Your Mom." So I saw that online. I was like, I gotta order that shirt, you know. And it's funny. I'm glad that I have it. Although I do wish I'd ordered it in a larger size because, well, it's a little bit too tight. But anyway, I should also note that I previously highlighted Storm Thorgerson's work on Def Leppard's High and Dry album, which you might want to check out that review of. Both the episode and the album itself are potentially worth listening to. I don't know if you like album reviews. But anyway, when it comes to the commercial success of this album, it almost sounds unreal because the Dark Side of the Moon spent 741 consecutive weeks on the Billboard 200 chart. So that's over 14 straight years, if I'm doing my math correctly. And yeah, that's a wow. And yeah, it's a top selling album. You know, it's considered an all time classic. And what's interesting is that even people who don't normally listen to this type of music sometimes connect with the album, you know, because underneath all the studio experimentation, the themes are deeply relatable. The fear of wasting time, like you're doing by listening to this episode, and the pressure from work and from society, conflict with other people, questions about death and meaning and melancholy. Those ideas do not age, you know, they're always going to be with us. And maybe that's why the album keeps finding new audiences generation after generation. More than 50 years later, The Dark Side of the Moon still feels modern. And that's because it predicted the future technologically in some ways. And it understood something timeless about being human. You know, you know, it's just one of those things, you know. You're gonna live and then you die. So the album is ambitious without losing emotion, experimental without becoming inaccessible, and that balance is incredibly hard to achieve. Like even though I like some experimental music, like I gotta admit, some of it is hit or miss, and that's true of pop music as well. But man, when it misses, it can really miss, and when it's a hit, well, it can really hit. And this is one of those times where it really hit. So if earlier Pink Floyd records explored the outer edges of psychedelic rock, this was the moment they turned experimentation into something universal. It's an album that could challenge listeners emotionally and technically while still reaching millions of people around the world. And once you hear it all the way through, uninterrupted, it's easy to understand why it became such a big part of music history.